After a month in the hospital, hobbling down my front walk with discharge papers folded in my pocket and Anthony's roses, wilted, stubborn, in a paper cup on the dashboard, I felt like I was coming home. The door opened and my son stood there, as if he'd been waiting on the porch for me all along. He looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was larger with all the things that had happened to me in the last 30 days. He glanced past me to the car, to the cane at my hand, to the oxygen tubing I'd left in the hospital bag. His voice was flat, practiced. "We had everything signed while you were away," he said. "The house isn't yours anymore. The papers are right here." He stepped to the side and held out a folder. The air was thin and bright. The late afternoon sun cut across his face. For a moment I could only hear my own breath, the rasp of the cane on the porch boards. The roses trembled in my lap like something afraid to tell the truth. What are you supposed to do when your only child tells you, at your own front door, that your life no longer belongs to you? I looked at the folder. Power of attorney, deeds, transfer documents, signatures. None of it made sense to me at first. I'd signed a POA months ago, after a fall in the house, to make things easier if Anthony and I needed help. I trusted my son to handle the practicalities. I'd been a bank compliance officer for 30 years. I'd trained my hands and my mind to read paper, to know when ink told the truth and when it lied. That training leveled me out like a keel. But standing on my own threshold, looking at the neat stack of papers in Richard's hands, I felt the keel snap. He read the paragraph as if it were routine. The power of attorney had been activated, the title deed recorded, funds transferred. The words slid out clean and cold. "We did what had to be done," he said. "You should stay with your friend for a while. It'll be easier if—" Easier? For whom? I had been in the hospital for hip surgery. I knew what post-operative fatigue felt like. I knew the simple indignities a hospital could impose, the plastic bedding, the early morning nurse rounds, the way a person's autonomy gets parceled into schedules and pills. I did not know yet that my month of recuperation had been used as a window for something far more methodical than convenience. I left the porch with my cane and the folder like a small, heavy heart. I did not argue with Richard then. I was too stunned to manufacture outrage. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet in his face was the instrument of betrayal. We ended up in a motel that night. The fluorescent light in the room buzzed exactly as a motel light should. I sat at the edge of the bed, the folder open on my lap, and read. The signatures looked like mine. My name under the ink, my initials in the margins. But I knew the subtleties of my own hand, the weight I gave to a loop, the way I crossed a T when I was tired. It did not look right. I called Gloria. She picked up on the second ring, and the sound of her voice, that steady, legal calm, was as close to a harbor as I'd had since the door slammed. Gloria and I had been friends since our children were in kindergarten. She'd been a lawyer for as long as I'd been a banker. When I explained, she did not gasp. She asked me to slow down and tell her, detail by detail, what I had. "Bring me copies," she said. "Everything, even emails, texts, everything he showed you. Don't sign anything else. I'll call you back in an hour." She did not say, "I'm so sorry." She didn't need to. She said, "We're going to find out what happened." While she worked, I did what I had always done when faced with an anomaly. I traced the money. I pulled up my online account. My hands still remembered the login even when my hip forgot how to carry me, and began to map the ledger like a river on a bad day. 5 transfers. The entries were abrupt, surgical. Out, 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 out. The timestamps clustered during the week I'd been under mid-level sedation and then heavy pain meds. They were not random withdrawals. They had a cadence. Wire transfers go through a choreography of logs and timestamps and authorizations. I read the headers the way other people read recipes. The transfers left my account and reappeared in places I did not recognize, under names that at first seemed like the dream of a businessman's child. Companies that called themselves investments, property acquisitions, holding LLCs with names that could be anything, and therefore nothing. I could see, too, small amounts that looked like bribes, payments to a payroll company, to a nurse's side account, to somebody's consultancy. I didn't know whose yet, but the pattern was not chaotic. It was planned. When Gloria arrived, she sat at the motel table with a legal pad and a thermos of coffee, and we began to build the skeleton of what would become our case. She listened, and she drew circles on the pad where my fingers lay. She knew how quickly these things could metastasize if you only gave them time. "You were vulnerable," she said, and there was no anger in her voice that I could not already feel. There was, instead, strategy. But you were also in the right place at the wrong time, and you're taking it back. We found the first thin vein of answer in county property records. That's one of the perks of being an ex-banker. You know where to look when the money moves. The addresses rolled out, houses on our block, a duplex down the lane, an old florist's property across from the diner. The names on those deeds were the same as the names on the LLCs to which my funds had been transferred. And worse, rezoning applications appeared, half hidden in municipal filings, proposing small multifamily developments where single-family homes had stood for decades. It was a collection plan, deliberate. Buy the lots, change the use, increase density, cash out. Veronica's name came up too. Her parents' names, Raymond and Claudia Sterling, kept appearing in the filings as well, either listed directly or as trustees and principals of those same shell corporations. Suddenly, the neat domestic shape of the betrayal gathered shadow. This was not a private theft, but a small, predatory enterprise. "You think they planned all this?" Gloria asked. I said nothing for a long time. I thought of Anthony at his desk, the way he kept his pens lined up by color, the letters he wrote and never sent. I thought of all the times I trusted Richard to be the practical son, the one who paid the bills, the man I would call when a bank letter arrived, and I needed someone who could read it without fear. There are ways we give pieces of ourselves to those we love, and ways those pieces can be used. I had always been proud of the way Richard could balance a checkbook. I had not been proud enough. The next week became a study in patience, and forensic patience is a form of vengeance that requires discipline. We subpoenaed records. We traced transfers through intermediary accounts and discovered payees that returned repeatedly to the same names: a private caregiver agency, a local title company, an apparently innocuous community investment fund. One, we found emails, old ones, drafty and terse, between Veronica and a property broker that hinted at a network buying in concentric circles. We pulled up public social media and saw party photos where the Sterlings and Veronica toasted to new beginnings, while in the background a house on our street had a sold sign on it. Every piece of evidence knitted together the outline of a plan. The Sterlings were buying up aging homeowners' properties in our neighborhood, filing rezoning petitions to increase density, and using those moves to create enough leverage for a flip. The power of attorney, a document I had trusted Richard to keep simple, had been their scalp. The transfers had been the fuel. There were practical details, documents to copy, affidavits to draft, timelines to lock down. There were also harder things, deciding to call the FBI. I had retired from the bank with a certain disdain for theatrics. But when money is moved in patterns and people's vulnerabilities are exploited, federal agents become the right instrument. Gloria made the call to a contact at the Financial Crimes Division. She did it in the pragmatic tone I knew from every courtroom drama she'd ever steered me through. Under-promise, over-deliver. Agents Rips and Callahan arrived the next afternoon. They were both competent and quieter than you would think. Quiet in the ways that make you trust them to sift through a lifetime of private details with respect. We sat in the motel room and walked them through the ledger. I explained the 5 transfers as best I could: the entries, the timestamps, the routing numbers, the way the signatures on the POA differed in pressure and flow from the ones I usually made. When I used jargon, Gloria translated. The agent with the clipboard kept asking me to slow down and repeat the names of accounts until they matched up in their notes. We need access to the hard files, Rip said. We'll need to see the Sterling's computers, the title company logs, the bank branch surveillance, if possible. We'll coordinate with the state attorney. This looks organized. We can pull warrants. I remember the surge of something then. A raw, bright certainty that we had at last moved from the place of being acted upon to being actors. It was not comforted. It was strategic. Gloria and I spent nights assembling exhibits like women preparing for war. Stacks of bank printouts, copies of deeds, screenshots of rezoning proposals, a timeline printed in bullet points. I told the agents what I knew about internal bank protocols, how a POA activation should be verified, what red flags get triggered in wire transfers, the oddities of transfers to holding companies. They listened and took notes with a kind of hungry focus that made me feel useful again instead of fragile. We also put surveillance in place around the house. Veronica owned a salon 2 towns over. She came and went. The Sterlings, older and practiced, moved their time in and out of our block, like committed patrons visiting a familiar theater. We had neighbors who had watched their houses be circled by investors and had stories that lined up like vertebrae. We taped together their accounts with the bank records, and the picture that emerged was ugly and methodical. One night, after a week of hovering between fury and freezing fear, I found myself back on the porch of my empty house. The house had a board over the front window. Sergeant Halverson from the local precinct met me at the sidewalk. He shook his head once, sadly, and then handed me a small paper showing the emergency restraining order. My name was on the order as the person to whom the injunction belonged. The order temporarily barred anyone, from altering the property or removing items while the investigation went forward. They had obtained a freeze on the title the day before. The bank had honored it. It was small comfort. The house was safe for the moment, a museum of what had been. That night, we executed a careful, quiet return through a side door. It was my idea, born of a compulsion to see whether anything of mine had been disturbed. Gloria and the agents preferred that I not go inside. I insisted. I had to see Anthony's desk. I had to see whether someone had rifled through his papers like a cruel gossip. We moved through the back, in and out of the rooms like people who had once called this place home and were now strangers in it. The smell of the house, tea, dust, the faint citrus of old cleaners wrapped around me like a memory. The living room looked as if we had stepped out for dinner and never returned. Anoni's pipe still lay on the bookshelf. The quilts in the guest room were folded the way he used to fold them. But there were things we found that did not belong. An unfamiliar box under the bed with receipts from a medical supply company. A set of photographs, printed on glossy paper, clipped together with a rubber band, showing my hospital bed from 3 different angles. One image focused on the IV, one on a tray with medication, another on a chart penciled with notes. The photos were taken without permission, without my knowledge. Someone had photographed me while I was most helpless. Gloria handed me a small recorder, our own device, and I pressed it into the pocket of my robe, like a child tucking a talisman in my sleeve. We moved through the house slowly, methodically. In the study, tucked behind a row of legal pads, we found a USB drive. The drive held audio. I recognized the voice before I recognized the words. It was thin, smoky, and familiar. It was Raymond Sterling's voice, angry, clipped, leaning into something he thought was power. "You signed it," he said on the recording, and his voice tilted in triumph. "She was out. We can close tonight. We can push the rezoning next month. You know what needs to be done." The tape cut. For a breath, I could not breathe. I played it again and again until the room tilted. The recording was messy and small, but it was enough. Enough to show intent. Enough to show that they were not only moving money, but orchestrating a plan. timing hospital stays, speaking about closing, coordinating rezoning. Enough to show that my disappearance into a hospital room had been treated not as a misfortune, but as an opportunity. The FBI had been sitting on many of these pieces as we worked. Agents coordinated with local police and moved their warrants. The day the raid happened, it felt less like an event and more like the inevitable closing of a long, cold door. I watched from the lawn as men in plain clothes and uniforms moved like a choreography through the Sterling's properties, carrying boxes and evidence bags. They retrieved hard drives, bank statements, notebooks with names and numbers. They spoke to neighbors and gathered testimony. Veronica was taken in, her face ashen, her hands small and oddly urgent, along with Raymond and Claudia. The officers read them their rights in a voice that makes things final. A friend later said she had seen the Sterlings leave in separate cars, the way a family feels its shape being broken into pieces. Afterward, officers brought me a small sealed package of seized documents from our house, what they had recovered that morning. Among the glossy printouts were more photos, the hospital room images again, clearer now, labeled with dates. A ledger showed payments to a nurse named Miranda Jenkins. There were also notes, handwritten, that suggested arrangements for longer-term care. The word institutionalize appeared in one margin with a scrawled date. When I saw Miranda's name, my stomach tightened. I knew she had worked on my floor, a soft-voiced woman who had come in at odd hours. The document suggested she had been paid for extra shifts, over and above her payroll, during the week of my surgery. Later, in a sterile interview room, Miranda would sit across from agents with her hands folded and her face crumpled. She would admit to tampering with medication, doses altered, timing off, so that my stay was protracted. She would tell them she'd been paid by an account linked to a title company connected to the Sterlings. "I thought I was helping," she would say, voice breaking. "I didn't think—" And then she would stop. When told, I felt a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with my hip. I am no stranger to the frailty of human judgment. As a compliance officer, I had audited hundreds of curious decisions. But to think that someone might have deliberately changed the course of my recovery, it made the room close in on me. The agents were careful with their language, deliberate in their phrases, alleged tampering, under investigation, cooperating witness. They walked me through the chain of custody of the evidence with professional tenderness. They advised me not to speak publicly. They said the words that have become a necessary lens in our culture. "We are investigating possible attempted homicide." They did not say it as accusation. They said it as possibility, as something the evidence must determine. What does one do with such an idea? How do you carry the notion that someone might have been willing to cause you physical harm to speed the sale of a house and the profit of a plan? I thought of being in the hospital bed, the sterile light on the ceiling, the beeping machine like a small, indifferent metronome. Then I thought of Anthony, patient, steady, the man who would leave me letters about how to set the table. His absence was a constant in the room now, and my anger was both for him and at the space he had left that apparently made room for opportunists. Meanwhile, the bank was conducting its own forensic. An internal review flagged the activation of the POA as suspicious because it occurred with incomplete verification at a branch that had later been involved in multiple contested transactions. In plain terms, the safeguards had been bypassed in a way that suggested collusion. That is where the ledger meets the human hand. A POA can be a help or a loophole. When it is abused, it becomes an instrument of theft. Richard was arrested weeks later, not at the raid, but after a federal grand jury subpoenaed his phone records. The call logs placed him in conversations with Veronica and with a number registered to a title company. He was charged. He was fingerprinted. He was not dragged away in handcuffs from my front step. He sat across from an agent with his hands folded like a man who had been expecting storms for a long time. We met twice in small, bleak rooms that smelled of coffee and old carpeting. The first was an interview with the agents, questions, and a recorder. The second was a visit through glass, where I could see him but not touch him. He spoke differently in each context. In the interview room, he was defensive initially, then broken. In the visitation booth, his hair was longer, his eyes rimmed with tiredness, and when he told me he had signed papers, his hands trembled. He said he had been in debt. That money had gone to pay off things he didn't tell me, that he had been frightened of losing his home in an earlier mortgage scare. He said the Sterlings had offered him a way to solve those problems quickly. I should have stopped, he said. I should have said no. He told me that he hadn't known, he insisted he hadn't known, about the medical manipulations. He said he had believed it was a financial fix, that they would make the repairs and everything would be fine. The agents had evidence of his involvement in transfers. He did not deny the transfers. He tearfully accepted responsibility for his part. Later, he pleaded, reached a deal to plead guilty to charges relating to theft and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. I'll give them what they need, he told me. I'll make it right the only way I can. There are many ways to betray and many ways to be betrayed. Richard's eyes when he looked at me were not the eyes of a monster, but of a man who had been broken into by need and by the promises of others. That did not excuse him, but it complicated him. It complicated my grief. I had to hold both condemnation and a dull, exhausted love in the same palm. The letter from Anthony, found in a drawer, the ink still his advice folded into his careful loops, became a hinge in that room. He had written once about forgiveness as a practice and not a verdict. He had written about accountability and the slow work of repair. When I let the letter fold into my hand, my cheeks burned and my throat closed. We were building a public file that felt like the scaffolding of justice. The agents arrested the Sterlings and took Veronica in. The bank froze suspicious accounts. The title company that had processed the deed was under suspension pending review. Miranda, the nurse, became a cooperating witness and provided a statement admitting to altering medication schedules and accepting payments from a bank account connected through the same chain that linked back to the Sterlings. She pled to a lesser charge in exchange for her cooperation. The terms of that arrangement were handled by prosecutors and would be submitted to court filings. All of these actions were framed carefully in the language of law. Charged, alleged, investigated, pleaded. I learned to be careful with my own language because words can become evidence too. One night, after a long day of going through exhibits with the agents, I sat alone in the kitchen at our little motel table and watched an old dog-eared kettle sigh on the stove. The domestic details of life, tea at 3, the dent in Anthony's chair, were the counterweights that kept me tethered to my identity. They were also what I fought to protect. When I spoke to neighbors who had lost homes to the same pattern, I heard variations of my own story. A hospitalization here, a sudden investment opportunity there, a revolving door of alleged caretakers passing through. The pattern became not just about my house, but about what happens in communities where aging meets predation. I slept fitfully. Some nights I was so exhausted that the motel room felt like a spaceship and my body returned in portions. In the daylight, I marched through paperwork. In the evenings, after the agents left, I allowed myself to grieve. I lit a candle for Anthony and said his name out loud. I let myself look at the roses and remember the way he used to whistle when the kettle boiled. I told myself that grief was not weakness, but a resource. If you could carry it, you could use it. There were victories in the small things. The temporary restraining order allowed us to remove certain personal items from the house. Photographs, letters, the old ledger where Anthony had kept the family accounts. We replaced the locks, installed a simple camera outside the back door, and put signs up warning of legal protection on the property. Neighbors brought boxes of cookies and casserole dishes, like a practical liturgy. Eleanor Jameson, who lived 2 doors down and had watched our block transform over the years, became a steady presence. She came with a thermos and a knack for making anyone feel defended. She was, in the unromantic and essential way neighbors are, the kind of ally you want when the world has been rearranged. But the larger work remained, proving intent, tying the transfers to the Sterling's property purchases, showing the link between orchestrated hospital stays and profit motives. The USB drive, the photos, the handwritten marginalia, these were our bones. The agents, in their gentle, bureaucratic way, were building muscle on them. One afternoon, Gloria and I sat in the little kitchen with another stack of documents and a list of people who still needed to be interviewed. "We'll be moving to grand jury soon," she said. "We have to keep the integrity of this file. Publicity will complicate things." "People will ask how this could happen," I said. "They'll wonder how to spot the signs." We began to talk about what might come after, the house's restoration, how to get neighbors protected from predatory rezoning, how to make sure a POA couldn't be turned into a tool for theft again. There was a kernel of hope in planning, a way to take the rawness of the experience and make it into something that could prevent another person from living it. The sting and the arrests were a culmination of method and endurance, but they weren't the end. After they were taken into custody, and after the first wave of evidence came back clearer, I stood in my living room with a box of items I'd reclaimed and felt the house like a patient recovering from surgery, wounded, tender, stubbornly alive. And yet, even with arrests made and evidence catalogued, the deeper questions remained open like a wound we hadn't yet learned to dress. Was what had happened to me just the product of greedy opportunists? Or had it been enabled by systemic lapses, by a system that places the elderly in precarious intersections between health, finance, and family? Had the instruments meant to protect us, POAs, banks, hospitals, been turned into loopholes by those who understand their workings too well? As the agents prepared files for the grand jury and the prosecutor's office began to shape charges, I found myself returning to the moments that felt like turning points. The door on the porch, the folder in Richard's hands, the photographs of my hospital bed. Those images had become markers on a map of my life. I could trace the path backward and forward, and in doing so, I learned a kind of new cartography, the outlines of predators and the lines of defense. When I left the motel that afternoon to go back into our house to collect more personal items under the watch of an officer, there was a mailbox that still had Anthony's name on it. I retrieved a thin envelope he had mailed to me, stamped with his handwriting, addressed months before he died. Inside was a short note, practical, a reminder about the water heater, a joke about the foolhardiness of misplacing the screwdriver. But at the bottom, he had written one line I read 10 times. "Guard the things you value, Isa, but never forget to guard the people first." It felt like a charge and an apology both. I stayed in the kitchen, holding that paper until my hands crumpled the edges. To guard people meant something different now. It meant rebuilding trust with my son in a way that would not hasten forgiveness, but would require honesty. It meant holding institutions to the light. It meant, perhaps, that what had been taken could be turned into the work of protecting others. We had many more rooms to enter in this story, rooms with subpoenas still pending, interviews yet to tape, and a visitation with a son who had pleaded and agreed to help. We had to follow the money further, and to name all its conduits. But as I sat there, the paper between my fingers, I felt the heat of purpose begin to gather. The house could be mended. The ledger could be corrected. The pain could be turned into a map that others might use to avoid the same fall. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. It helps me imagine who I'm talking to out there, in the wide and changing world beyond these walls. The next weeks felt like living inside a hinge. Every movement pivoted between the mechanical business of a case and the private work of learning how to be alive again. Grand jury dates were set. Subpoenas arrived like small formal storms. Gloria and the agents guided the way, and I learned the rhythms of courtroom corridors, the cold tile, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the way lawyers move as if memory is a commodity they bargain with. We sat through hearings that were, in essence, translations of the ledger into human terms. Accountant after accountant, title officer after title officer, came to the stand and explained what the spreadsheets meant. Layered transfers through intermediary accounts, checks made out to LLCs whose addresses were P.O. boxes, signatures that, when magnified, showed pressure points inconsistent with my usual hand. Forensic analysts walked us through metadata from emails, timestamps that matched the moments the funds moved. The USB drive's audio was entered as evidence. Then the glossy photos were laid out, face up, like flattened birds. Miranda's testimony was one of the clearest, hardest moments. I listened from the witness room as she described a pattern she had once justified with self-talk and fear. She admitted that she had adjusted doses and schedules because she had been paid. She said she had been embarrassed to tell me, afraid of losing her job, and later feared legal consequences. She cried a little in the witness chair, and she said, in a voice that reached like a thread, "I didn't understand how bad it would get." She pled to a lesser charge and reached an agreement to cooperate, an arrangement the prosecutors explained to me in clinical terms. But the human cost was there on the record. A woman with a soft voice recounting decisions that had consequences I felt in my bones. When Richard's name came up in grand jury testimony, my hands tightened around the paper cup of coffee I'd been given. It was a terrible public intimacy to have one's family name paraded across transcripts. He testified, more precise than in the visitation booth, about conversations, about transfers he'd authorized, about people who had seemed to give him a way out of a pile of debt that felt like quicksand. He explained his method. He would sign where instructed. He would approve transfers when asked. He would rely on the documents shown to him. He did not invent reasons. He spoke plainly about fear and shame and misjudgment. Afterwards, outside the courthouse, Gloria put a hand to my shoulder and said quietly, "You did the right thing." I could see why she felt it that way. The file was cleaner now, the network of accounts mapped. We had a narrative that matched the entries in the bank ledger. Still, it did not make the personal pain any smaller. There was a strange, private grief to watching your life reduced to testimony and paper. But there was also a fierce relief in the fact that truth, at least insofar as it can be demonstrated with bank routing numbers and recorded voices, was able to travel. The prosecution moved with steady, patient care. The Sterling's arraignments were public. Veronica's face was still ashen when she entered the courtroom, her eyes hard set as if someone had taught her to make resolve look like a substitute for softness. The evidence stack grew. Prosecutors filed counts of wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The hospital's internal review board furnished documents, and the hospital complied with subpoenas for chart logs and shift schedules. The title company's internal auditor turned over communications that placed employees in the crosshairs, the kinds of clerical shortcuts that can look like negligence until they look like collusion. There were small victories in the interim. The bank issued an internal statement acknowledging procedural lapses at a branch that had processed the deed transfers. The county issued a temporary freeze on the rezoning petitions tied to those same LLCs. Neighbors who had once felt too small to speak came to public meetings and told their stories. A municipal councilman who had been skeptical at first listened, and then, inexplicably, he wrote to the county planning office asking for an audit of procedural compliance in rezoning petitions for any properties recently acquired from homeowners over 60. And then the plea deals arrived like a slow unwrapping of the legal machinery. I learned the vocabulary of bargains: accepted plea, reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, sentenced. The prosecutors, measured and careful, explained that the Sterlings had been offered plea agreements as part of the broader effort to dismantle the enterprise and to recover assets for victims. The Sterlings agreed to those terms. The public filings recorded the results. Raymond Sterling was sentenced to 20 years. Claudia Sterling received 15 years. Veronica Sterling was sentenced to 18 years. The terms were pronounced in the courtroom with the austere cadence of a judge who does not want to be mistake-prone. The sentences did not undo the months of my life I had spent at a motel table sorting receipts, nor did they replace the comfort of Anthony's voice. What they did, however, was mark on record an accounting that mattered, for the court, for future victims, for the public ledger that keeps track of harms and penalties. Miranda's sentence was reduced in exchange for her cooperation. That, too, was recorded and explained in the paperwork, the rationale being that her testimony enabled investigators to access evidence they otherwise might not have had. What followed judicially was a medley of practicalities: asset seizures, restitution hearings, the slow, bureaucratic work of trying to recover what could be recovered. The title company that had handled the deed transfers was subject to a disciplinary process. Some employees were suspended pending investigations. Banks updated a few internal procedures after the case was publicized. The Municipal Planning Office re-examined our neighborhood's rezoning petitions. None of these steps felt dramatic in the moment. They were tedious and slow, like physical therapy, but they were forward motion. I returned to the house with a small army of friends and neighbors on a bright Saturday in early fall. The sky was an honest blue, the way skies are when the air has been scrubbed by rain. Eleanor Jameson brought a wheelbarrow and a stack of old gardening magazines. Gloria came with a pair of gloves and a new sense of free time she confessed to me in a way that made both of us laugh through our fatigue. Agents Rips and Callahan came briefly to check that the property protections were holding and to say, with a look that said more than words could, "Call us if anything looks off." We moved through rooms like people returning to a house after a storm, cleaning, cataloging, making lists. We set Anthony's papers back on the desk exactly where he would have wanted them. The quilts were refolded and put back on the guest bed. We installed a simple alarm system, nothing ostentatious, and put up signage indicating the property was under legal protection. But the reclamation went beyond locks and cameras. Neighbors painted a fence with a brushstroke of color that felt like a collective signature. Someone brought over a pot of stewed pears, and the smell of cinnamon and sugar felt like an offering. I found that the smallest domestic rituals could be healing. I made tea in the kettle Anthony used to make smirk at, and when the whistle sang, I let it sing. I sat at the kitchen table and sorted through the pack of letters, photographs, and mementos that had been returned in evidence bags. Some things were missing: an old brooch from my grandmother, a carved wooden spoon Anthony had used for years. The loss of those objects is the kind of thing that lives like a small abrasion. It hurts in the edge of the hand where the spoon should have been. Other things returned like unexpected grace. A neighbor had rescued my box of seed packets and put them on my porch. Eleanor had weeded the rosebed and tied the stems in gentle slings so they would not break. We started small projects at first, resealing the joints on the front step, repairing the ripped linen curtains, repainting the sunroom. Then, under the influence of a gentle collective energy, neighbors began to ask if the house could become more than a private recovery. What if we fixed the sidewalk and planted native flowers? What if we hosted a meeting about POAs and what red flags elders and families should watch for? Gloria suggested bringing in a local nonprofit that worked on elder law. I suggested we put a name on it, something that honored Anthony and the way his steady hand had been our moral anchor through the chaos. And so the Anthony Miller Foundation was born, first in conversation at the kitchen table, then in a pro bono consultation with Gloria, who insisted we incorporate carefully and consider a mission that could address both prevention and recovery. The foundation would not be about sensational headlines. It would be practical. Workshops at community centers would teach families how to check bank statements, what questions to ask before signing a POA, how to document contacts with caregivers. We would work with local banks and title companies to encourage extra verification when elderly clients activated powers of attorney. We planned to host a small fund to help cover legal consultations for low-income seniors facing suspicious transfers, and to create a hotline that could connect people to vetted elder law attorneys. None of that could happen overnight. The foundation began with a small sum gathered from neighbors, a modest grant from a local philanthropic group that admired the way the neighborhood had rallied, and a crowdfunding campaign that reached out to people who had read about the case. The community support was quiet and deep. Donations in church envelopes, a framed photograph of our block signed by neighbors, a woman from the Rotary Club who offered administrative help for an afternoon a week. I learned that community is not an abstract thing. It is the shared willingness to show up with a wheelbarrow, to bring soup, to sign a petition. Richard, throughout the legal process, moved through stages I recognize in weather patterns. There were days when he was clear and focused, diligent about the paperwork he'd been given to assist prosecutors with, then nights when the weight returned. After his plea, his cooperation involved testifying against elements of the network. He was called to give statements and provide access to communications. It was a small but essential part of the evidence mosaic. In the visitation room where glass separated us, he read to me once from a short paragraph he had written in his lawyer's office to explain himself to me. It began with an apology and ended with a sentence that said simply, "I want to be better." I do not pretend to have forgiven him in a single motion. Forgiveness, if it is to mean anything, must be slow and conditional, earned through consistent behavior, through accountability, through the work he agreed to do to make restitution where he could. We set boundaries. He moved into a program that helped him get financial counseling and work with a restitution plan. His legal consequences were part of a negotiated outcome. They were also a form of education. The most painful part to me was not his legal culpability, but the way he had been pulled into a narrative that made him act against his better self. I had to find a way to have anger and to keep a channel open for the person he might yet become. In the months that followed, I found myself speaking at a few small venues, senior centers, neighborhood associations, a church group. I spoke not from a place of self-righteousness, but from experience. I talked about signatures and timestamps, about the small anomalies that can be GPS points on a larger map of fraud. I taught a basic exercise Gloria and I had developed for checking for aesthetic red flags on documents, and asked neighbors to create a buddy system, 2 people who would cross-check major financial moves for any elderly person in the community. The goal was modest, to give people a few practical habits that might mean a difference in a tight moment. One of the things that surprised me most was the number of people who came forward with stories that were like mine but not mine, variations on a predatory theme. A widow 2 blocks over had been approached by a man who offered to pay her mortgage if she handed him a manager's check. A retired school teacher was suddenly encouraged to consider a new investment that would require her to transfer title to a holding company. The common thread was vulnerability to pressure, whether that pressure came cloaked in sentiment or convenience. The Foundation's early programming focused on building awareness and creating networked watchers, neighbors, faith communities, family friends, people who could spot when a pattern looked off. There were painful days in the public arc of the case, too. Sentences, for instance, sit on a record and function as both punishment and an example. I sometimes found myself reading press accounts and wincing at the way the narrative had been condensed into a few lines for the evening news. Once, a headline reduced Richard to a single adjective. I called Gloria, and we discussed how to manage public statements, how to speak plainly without inflaming or sensationalizing. Justice, I had learned, required careful language. The legal process also unfolded private surprises. As assets were recovered and auctions scheduled, it became clear that reclaiming stolen money is never neat. Some funds were tied up in mortgages on other properties. Other funds had been spent. Restitution hearings became exercises in arithmetic and negotiation. The courts ordered restitution where possible, and the Sterling's seized assets were put through a process meant to repay victims. I was cautious with expectations. The point was not to harvest vengeance, but to see if the system could at least offer a sliver of repair. The judge took pains to explain the restitution process in a way that made it feel procedural rather than cathartic, and after a long, patient hearing, the court issued orders that sought to balance criminal sentencing with victim recompense. During these months, I kept a smaller rhythm at home. I planted roses again, different cultivars, bright and thorny. Eleanor taught me to prune. She likes to talk about the right cut in gardening, as if it is a small secular sacrament. Our neighbors began to bring plants they could not keep, anonymous offerings that showed up on the porch with a note. There was an English lavender in a chipped pot that smelled like a sun-warmed window. The soundscape of the house returned in small layers. The creak of the stairs that Anthony used to use the most, a kettle's whistle, the muffled laughter of children playing 2 houses down. These small returns mattered in ways that no sentence or restitution could fully touch. At the Foundation's formal launch, there was a modest gathering in the community center. Gloria presided over the registration table as if she had been preparing for a trial and a party at the same time. We printed a brochure that included a checklist of red flags, sudden transfers during hospital stays, new names on deeds, unsolicited offers to handle things for elderly relatives, and payments to caregivers outside payroll. We made the materials accessible and not judgmental. The goal was to inform, not to alarm. One of the first programs we developed was a workshop modeled on the one Gloria and I had used, how to read bank statements for anomalies. Another was a simple training for caregivers about ethics and reporting. We partnered with a local caregiver agency that volunteered to host sessions on how to document hours and payments properly. We created a small panel of elder law attorneys who offered pro bono consultations 1 afternoon a month. The work was grassroots and looked from a distance like ordinary neighborliness, but it also felt like building a small firewall. People asked me what I would have done differently had I known. I told them I would have not handed all the practical power to one person, no matter how much I loved him. I would have kept multiple checks in place, dual signatories, third-party oversight, a trusted attorney's review for big transfers. But I also said something less tidy. I would have trusted my instincts earlier. When the signatures looked off, when the timing of transfers matched the week I was sedated, there was an instinctive discomfort that I had shoved aside in my desire not to make life harder for my son. That kind of compromise, I realized, can be fatal to both self-preservation and healthy boundaries. There were tender, awkward moments, too. Richard came over one afternoon several months after his plea was entered. He brought a wrapped candle and a sheaf of notes, small things for which restitution cannot account. We talked about small domestic details, how to reset a router, how to plant garlic bulbs in a sunny patch of soil. He had completed the counseling program and had found a part-time job that allowed him to begin making restitution payments. There was no sweeping embrace, no immediate reconciliation. Instead, there were cautious gestures, set boundaries, a promise to attend therapy regularly, and to remain transparent with bank access. We continued to see legal fallout. The title company faced fines and a regulatory review. A few employees were disciplined. The bank instituted changes in verification processes for POAs after internal audits and public pressure. At the municipal level, hearings about rezoning included a new public notice requirement for properties acquired from elderly owners, an adjustment that felt small but might, in time, protect someone else from the rapid consolidation we had faced. Some nights, after a day of meetings and foundation tasks, I would sit alone in the study and read the letters Anthony had left. The last one I read aloud to myself often contained a line about stubbornness, how sometimes the thing that looks like stubbornness is simply fidelity to what matters. In the quiet of the house, with the roses catching the evening light, fidelity felt like a brand of courage, to hold on to what was mine and to turn that energy outward so others would have less need of such bitter reclamation. There were moments of anger, too, embedded like pebbles in the path of recovery. It is a strange thing to carry rage with the knowledge that rage must be held, measured, and used. I found uses for it. I wrote letters to local officials, pushed for transparency, met with community planners. Gloria and I testified at a county council hearing about elder protections. Our testimony was practical. Suggestions about mandatory waiting periods for major transfers when a POA is active, better signage at municipal offices for potential conflicts of interest where third-party purchasers are involved, training for bank tellers and title officers on identifying forged signatures. We were careful not to sound like experts prescribing law. We spoke from the vantage of people who had lived through the cost. The foundation began to draw donors who had been touched by similar stories. Small grants arrived, and with them the ability to hire a part-time coordinator who could manage calls and match callers with a vetted elder law attorney for a short consultation. The hotline was modest at first, open a few hours a week, but it became a place where neighbors could ask a question and feel heard. We connected with a statewide seniors advocacy group and shared our workshops. People began to tell us that our materials helped them catch suspicious changes before they escalated. Public recognition was not the point, but it came in forms that were oddly comforting. A columnist wrote about our block, and strangers sent notes saying they were forming their own neighbor check teams. A local radio show invited me to speak about POAs on a short segment. What struck me most was that the story resonated not because it was sensational — people do not always want trauma — but because it felt recognizably human. The need to trust, the shock of betrayal, and the slow slog of repair. As the calendar pages turned, the house kept changing in small, hopeful ways. We replaced the missing brooch with a thrifted pin that had similar bluing. It is not the same gold as Grandma's, but when sunlight hits it, I sometimes imagine the memory is restored a little. The garden took on an identity all its own, with neighbors contributing things that made it collective. A lavender hedge from the neighbor down the lane, a line of comfrey from Eleanor, a rosemary from Veronica's former sister-in-law, oddly enough, who had chosen to stand with us rather than against us when the doors opened to let the truth be heard. I continued to carry the letter Anthony had written, his note about guarding people before things, and its instruction shaped how I approached my son. There was a carefulness that was different from the brittle fury I had felt on the porch the day he handed me the folder. We began, slowly, to have conversations that were less about blame and more about structures, how to rebuild finances, how to set up checks and balances that prevented unilateral decisions. He agreed to be transparent with his communications for a time, to have Gloria review certain documents before any transfers, and to participate in community workshops to understand the systemic harm that had pulled him into the web of the Sterling scheme. People ask me whether I ever considered giving up the house for good. There were moments when the house felt like a repository of pain too heavy to carry. But what I discovered, slowly and stubbornly, was that the house had always been more than wood and brick. It was the place where Anthony and I had practiced a life of ordinary affection. Reclaiming it felt like honoring that life rather than letting criminality define the space. The legal files eventually closed, in the sense that active investigations wound down, and court dockets moved into the long shadow of appeals and collections. The public attention quieted to a low hum. The foundation, which had seemed in its first year a fragile thing, settled into a steady, modest pace of work. We helped neighbors file complaints. We hosted a quarterly forum with local officials. We produced a simple pamphlet on POAs, translated into 3 languages spoken in our community. On a crisp spring morning, a year or so after the door incident, I stood on my porch and watched a parade of kids from the block march by with paper crowns and a banner that read, in a child's scrawl, "Our neighborhood." It felt, in a way that paperwork never could, like a closing of a painful loop. The house was filled with light, and inside, on the mantel, sat an old photograph of Anthony and me, holding hands on a picnic bench, younger and grinning at the camera. I thought of the long months of investigation, of the moment when I'd opened the folder to find my life translated into legalese, and I felt, not a complete peace, that is not the posture of realism, but a kind of settled resolve. What I would say to someone who finds themselves on a porch, folder handed over by someone they trusted, is not a tidy formula. I would say, find someone who knows the language of money and words, an attorney, a bank compliance officer, a trusted friend who can read documents without the pressure of love clouding their judgment. Document everything. Keep copies. Build a small network of watchers. And remember that repair often requires both the sharpness of the law and the tenderness of the community. There are days when I still wake and reach instinctively for an absent presence. There are evenings when a song on the radio makes me think of Anthony's laugh. There are also days when a neighbor knocks and asks if I will sign a petition to retain a stop sign at the corner. Those knocks are the small, ordinary continuations of life, and they matter. If you've watched this far, thank you for holding space with me. If my story helps one person be more careful, to ask questions earlier, to notice a signature that sits odd on a page, then it has borne fruit. If you want to support our work, to help protect seniors in practical ways, please consider learning more about the Anthony Miller Foundation. Support helps us run workshops, keep a hotline running, and provide pro bono consultations for those who need them. There is no neat final chapter to what happened to me. There is a continuum of repair, accountability, and learning. I came home after a month in the hospital, and my son had handed my house to his wife's family. I lost, and I fought, and I reclaimed, not because I was invulnerable, but because I had people beside me, and because, reluctantly and fiercely, I refused to let that be the end. The house stands now, imperfect, loved, and guarded. The garden blooms in ragged, generous ways. The work continues. If this story touched you, if you think someone you love needs to hear it, please share it. And if you want to learn more about how to protect someone you care about, visit the Anthony Miller Foundation's page to find resources, workshops, and ways to support elder protection. Subscribe for more survivor stories, because telling them and listening to them is part of how we keep each other safe.